my dear snoozers. Tonight, we explore Atlantis, the ancient civilization said to have vanished without a trace, deliberately wiped from human memory. A society so advanced that its disappearance may have quietly reshaped the world we live in today. There are moments when I wonder if any of this is worth it. But then, I read one of your lovely comments, and it keeps me going. I haven't reached my goal of 1,000 subscribers yet, but I'm still fighting for it. If you want to support a small creator who truly cares about what she makes, it would mean the world if you subscribed. All right. Now let's get cozy. Find a comfortable position. Close your eyes, breathe in slow, and let's begin. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing at the edge of the most beautiful coastline you have ever seen. The air smells of salt and something sweeter, something you cannot name. The water is impossibly blue. The trees behind you are heavy with fruit. The stone buildings in the distance catch the golden light of a setting sun, and somewhere, music drifts toward you on a warm breeze. People are laughing. Children are running. Everything feels complete. Now imagine waking up, and none of it is there. That is the feeling encoded into the oldest stories of nearly every civilization on Earth. The memory of a paradise lost, a golden age that slipped through humanity's fingers like sand. The ancient Greeks called it the Age of Kronos. The Hindus spoke of the Satya Yuga. The Mesopotamians described a garden between rivers where life was effortless and divine. And Plato, perhaps most famously, gave us a name, Atlantis. But here is the question that should make you pause. Why would every culture, separated by oceans and centuries, tell the same story? Why is the lost paradise not the invention of one imagination, but the shared grief of an entire species? Scientists call this phenomenon cultural convergence, the idea that similar myths arise independently because humans share similar psychological needs. But there is another possibility, one that is quieter and far more unsettling. What if the memory is real? What if the paradise is not a fantasy, but a recollection, buried deep in the collective human mind like a dream you cannot quite shake when morning comes? Every story of a lost Eden carries within it not just longing, but detail. Specific, structural, geographical detail. And detail, as any historian will tell you, is not the language of fantasy. It is the language of memory. Picture yourself organizing your grandmother's attic. Boxes everywhere, old photographs, handwritten letters, jars of things you cannot identify. And then, tucked beneath a water-damaged trunk, you find a journal. Half of the pages have been torn out. What remains is beautiful and coherent, but the missing sections leave gaps that change everything you thought you understood about your family. That is what it feels like to study the earliest chapters of human history. We speak confidently about ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, as though these are the opening acts of civilization's story. But these cultures did not describe themselves as beginners. They described themselves as inheritors. The Egyptians spoke of a time before the pharaohs, a mythical era called Zep Tepi, meaning the first time, when gods walked among humans and the world was arranged according to a perfect celestial order. They did not claim to have invented their knowledge, they claimed to have received it. From whom? When the Library of Alexandria burned, we lost an estimated 700,000 scrolls. Think about that number. 700,000 individual documents, many of them copies of texts far older than Egypt itself. Gone. And Alexandria was not the only library to burn. Libraries in Carthage, in Tenochtitlan, in the great Indian centres of learning, all were destroyed, whether by fire, flood, conquest, or deliberate suppression. History, we assume, is cumulative. But what if it has also been at times deliberately reduced? What if the erasing of certain knowledge was not accidental, but intentional? The aha moment here is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the realization that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The missing pages of humanity's story may not have been lost, they may have been removed. And removed things, almost always, are removed for a reason. Think about the last time it rained so hard that the streets outside your window turned into rivers. Maybe you watched from a dry room, a little anxious, a little awed. Now multiply that feeling by everything you can possibly imagine, and then multiply it again. Because the floods embedded in the oldest human memories were not rainstorms, they were world-ending events. Across more than 200 independent cultures, the story is the same. Water rising beyond all reckoning. A chosen few surviving. A world rebuilt from almost nothing. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative that predates the biblical story of Noah by more than 1,000 years. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes the god Vishnu warning the sage Manu of a coming deluge. Indigenous tribes in the Americas, the Pacific Islands, and sub-Saharan Africa all carry versions of the same catastrophic memory. Now here is where science quietly steps in to say something remarkable. Around 11,600 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, something dramatic happened to the Earth. Massive ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere collapsed. Sea levels rose, by some estimates, by as much as 120 meters over several thousand years. Vast coastal regions and shallow continental shelves were permanently swallowed by the rising ocean. That is not mythology. That is geology. So when you hear ancient peoples describing a catastrophic flood that ended a great civilization, you are not hearing superstition. You are potentially hearing the preserved oral memory of a geological event so traumatic that it reshaped the human world almost beyond recognition. The flood was not a metaphor. The water was real. And whatever stood on those submerged coastlines before the water came, we have not yet found it. But the ocean has not forgotten. It simply has not spoken yet. Suppose you found yourself snorkeling off the coast of a warm, shallow sea, and through the shifting blue light below, you began to make out shapes. Not coral, not rock formations, but angles. Right angles, flat surfaces, walls. Imagine the particular chill that would run through you, not of cold water, but of recognition. That feeling of stumbling upon something that was not supposed to be there. That feeling is not hypothetical. It has been experienced by researchers, divers, and fishermen across the world. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, massive stone terraces and what appear to be carved platforms rest on the ocean floor, structures that some researchers argue are entirely natural and others insist bear the marks of intentional human construction. Off the Gulf of Cambay in India, sonar mapping revealed what appeared to be the foundations of a city, stretching across several kilometers of seabed submerged perhaps 9,000 years ago. Near Cuba, deep water exploration has produced images of geometric stone formations far below the surface. None of these sites has been conclusively explained. And that word, conclusively, is doing a great deal of work. What is not in dispute is this. During the last ice age, vast areas of land that are now underwater were dry, habitable coastal plains. The continental shelves of the world represent millions of square kilometers of land that early humans could have lived on, built on, and called home. And then the ice melted, and the sea took it. We have barely explored these underwater regions. Less than 20% of the ocean floor has been mapped in meaningful detail. The sunken cities may not be waiting to be discovered. They may simply be waiting for us to finally look. Imagine being handed a map of a city you have never visited, drawn with perfect accuracy, showing streets, districts, and landmarks in precise detail, and then being told that the map was made by someone who had never been there, who was simply copying an older map, which was itself a copy of a map. Even older still, Would you trust the map? And more importantly, would you wonder about the original cartographer? In 1433, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map that has never been fully explained. The map, drawn on gazelle skin, depicts the coastline of South America with remarkable accuracy. It also appears to show the coastline of Antarctica, the continent that would not officially be discovered for another 300 years. Piri Reis himself wrote on the map that he compiled it from older source documents, some of which he claimed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. Cartographers and historians have argued about this map for nearly a century. Some say the Antarctic coastline is coincidental, that it represents a distorted view of South American geography. Others point out that the map appears to show Antarctica without ice, matching the shape of the subglacial coastline that we only confirmed through modern sonar in the 1950s. Here is what makes this genuinely extraordinary. If the bedrock coastline of Antarctica was mapped before the ice covered it, that means the mapping occurred at least 6,000 years ago, possibly much longer, and the existence of such a map implies a civilization capable of global navigation, precise geographic measurement, and the kind of coordinated, long-range exploration we typically associate with modern humanity. The Piri Reis map is not alone. The Buach map, the Orontius Phineas map, all showing features that should not have been known. Someone knew. The question is who. Consider what it would be like if you wrote something down, something important, something you had researched and believed to be true, and for 2,400 years, people argued about whether you were writing history or fiction. That is the precise and somewhat poignant situation of Plato. Around 360 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, in which he described in considerable detail an advanced island civilization called Atlantis. He specified its location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar. He described its size, larger than Libya and Asia combined. He outlined its political structure, its wealth, its extraordinary engineering, its powerful navy, and he described its end, a single catastrophic day and night in which the island sank beneath the ocean. For centuries, scholars have debated whether Plato invented Atlantis as a moral allegory, or whether he was recording something real. The allegorical interpretation is tidy and comfortable. It allows us to appreciate Plato's philosophical genius without being required to overturn our entire understanding of human prehistory. But Plato was insistent. He stated explicitly that the story was not a myth, but a true account passed down through Egyptian priests to the Athenian statesman Solon, and from Solon's descendants to Plato himself. He used specific numbers, specific dates, 9,000 years before Solon's time. He named the geological features, the timeline, the downfall. Philosophers who make up parables rarely include this much verifiable geography. Here is the philosophical takeaway. Plato was not simply warning about Atlantis, he was warning about arrogance, about what happens to civilizations that mistake power for wisdom. The warning is not ancient, it is current. It is, perhaps, exactly the warning we need to hear right now. Picture yourself walking through a forest so thick and overgrown that every step requires effort. The canopy above you blocks most of the sky, roots clutch at your feet, and then, without any warning, the trees thin, and you step into a clearing filled with stone towers, intricate carvings, massive causeways stretching between structures, and a silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. This is not imagination. This is what 19th century explorers experienced when they stumbled upon Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the largest religious monument ever constructed, hidden for centuries beneath jungle growth. It was not lost because it was small. It was lost because the civilization that built it collapsed so thoroughly that the knowledge of its grandeur was nearly erased entirely. History is littered with empires that rose to extraordinary heights and then simply vanished. The Minoans of Crete built an advanced maritime civilization with running water, elaborate frescoes, and a writing system we still cannot fully decode, and then disappeared around 1500 BCE. The Indus Valley civilization, which at its peak encompassed more land than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, vanished so completely that we did not even know it had existed until 1921. And these are only the civilizations we have rediscovered. How many remain beneath the jungle floor, beneath the ocean, beneath the desert sands, still waiting? What strikes thoughtful minds is not the fact that these empires fell. Empires always fall eventually. What strikes the thoughtful mind is how completely they were forgotten. A civilization that builds in stone, that trades across continents, that writes laws and poetry and astronomical observations, does not simply slip quietly from memory, unless something catastrophic ensured that almost no one survived to remember. What if you woke up one morning and realized that the calendar hanging on your wall was not just a way to track appointments, but an encoded message left by someone thousands of years ago? A message about the rhythms of the cosmos that most people walk past every single day without ever noticing. That is not a hypothetical. That is, in a very real sense, what ancient calendars may be. The Mayan long count calendar, which concluded its 13th Biakatun cycle in 2012 and generated so much popular anxiety, is not a doomsday prediction. It is something far more interesting. It is a record of cosmic cycles so precise that modern astronomers have confirmed its accuracy in tracking celestial movements over vast timescales. The Maya accounted for the Venus cycle to within 2 seconds per year. They tracked the Pleiades. They calculated eclipses centuries in advance, without telescopes, without computers, without any instrument we have been able to identify. The ancient Egyptian calendar was synchronized to the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. The moment Sirius appeared on the horizon just before sunrise corresponded almost perfectly to the annual flooding of the Nile. This was not coincidence. It was a precision-engineered alignment of cosmic observation and agricultural planning that worked with mechanical reliability for thousands of years. The Sumerian calendar divided the sky into sections that form the basis of the zodiac system still in use today. All of these calendars share something beyond their sophistication. They all reflect a worldview in which human life is not separate from cosmic cycles, but embedded within them. A worldview that says the stars are not decoration, they are instruction. Who taught the ancients to read that instruction? And why did they go to such lengths to encode it into stone? Envision yourself as an architect, not with a computer, not with modern instruments, but with a knotted rope, a wooden peg, and an understanding of mathematical principles so refined that the building you are designing will still be standing, perfectly calibrated, 5,000 years from now. This is not fantasy. This is the working reality of the people who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/15 of a degree. Modern builders, using GPS and laser technology, struggle to achieve that precision. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height, when divided by 2, yields a figure extraordinarily close to pi, the mathematical constant that defines the relationship between a circle's circumference and its diameter. The ratio of the base to half the height yields a figure close to the golden ratio. Phi, the proportion found throughout nature in the spiraling of shells, the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, the proportions of the human body. These numbers do not appear to be accidental. They appear to be intentional, embedded, encoded. And the Great Pyramid is not alone. The temples of ancient India were built according to the Vastu Shastra, a system of sacred architectural principles rooted in geometric harmony. The Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe incorporated proportional systems derived from ancient mathematical traditions. The Parthenon in Athens contains the golden ratio in its facade. Across cultures, across centuries, across continents, the same mathematical relationships appear again and again in sacred architecture, as though different civilizations were all reading from the same original blueprint. Where did the blueprint come from? That question does not have a comfortable answer. But the geometry itself does not lie. It simply waits, carved into stone, for someone to ask the right question. Imagine if every library on Earth were destroyed tomorrow. Every digital archive, every server farm, every printed book, burned or erased. In 3 generations, the knowledge locked inside those libraries would not simply be forgotten. It would be mythologized. The people who remembered fragments would become priests and storytellers. The machines we left behind would become sacred objects. Our science would become legend. Now reverse that process and apply it to 10,000 years ago. This thought experiment is the quiet key to understanding something that troubles archaeologists and historians in equal measure. Why did agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and monumental architecture all seem to appear in multiple places around the world within a relatively narrow window of time, roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago? The standard explanation is independent invention, the idea that humans in different locations simply figured out the same things simultaneously. But buried beneath the surface of dozens of ancient sites, researchers have found anomalies that do not fit neatly into the independent invention model. At Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, the oldest known megalithic structures on Earth were deliberately buried by the people who built them, filled in with rubble as though being hidden, preserved, or concealed from something coming. In ancient Indian texts, the Vedas and Upanishads contain descriptions of aerodynamics, atomic theory, and the structure of consciousness that read, in translation, less like mythology and more like memory. Ancient Greek philosophers like Pythagoras, upon returning from Egypt, described having been taught mathematical principles of extraordinary depth, principles they admitted they had not derived themselves, but had received. Knowledge that arrives fully formed, without visible development, suggests a source. The buried knowledge of ancient civilizations may not be lost. It may simply be waiting, beneath our feet, for the tools and the willingness to dig deep enough. What if you were placed in a dark field, far from any city, on a night so clear that the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and someone handed you a map, not of the land around you, but of the sky, and told you that this map was also a map of the most sacred sites on Earth? That would be the experience of anyone who has seriously studied the relationship between ancient monuments and the stars above them. The 3 pyramids of Giza align precisely with the 3 stars of Orion's belt, specifically as they appeared in the sky around 10,500 BC, an alignment that matches not the period when Egyptologists believe the pyramids were built, but a date more than 7,000 years earlier. This has been the subject of intense academic debate since researcher Robert Bauval first proposed it in 1983. Critics have offered counter-arguments. Supporters have offered refinements. The alignment itself, however, has not been mathematically disproven. Angkor Wat in Cambodia mirrors the constellation Draco as it appeared in 10,500 BC, the same approximate date as the Giza alignment. The Nazca lines in Peru appear to correspond to star positions and solar events. The stone circles of Britain, including Stonehenge, are aligned to the movements of the sun and moon with an accuracy that required generations of careful observation to achieve. What this suggests is not merely that ancient peoples watched the sky. We already knew that. What this suggests is that certain sacred sites were deliberately positioned according to a coherent global astronomical framework, a framework that points, repeatedly, to a specific period in deep prehistory, as though someone was marking a moment, encoding a date, leaving a message written not in ink, but in stone and starlight. Consider what it would be like if you discovered that your grandfather's old pocket watch was not simply measuring hours and minutes, but was in fact a precision instrument calibrated to a cycle so vast that completing one full revolution would take 25,920 years. You would look at that watch differently. You would wonder about the person who built it. That is very close to what ancient astronomers understood about the Earth itself. The Earth does not simply spin on its axis. It wobbles. Like a gyroscope slowly losing momentum, the Earth's axis traces a great circle in the sky over the course of approximately 25,920 years. This cycle is called the precession of the equinoxes, and it means that the position of the stars relative to the Earth's horizon changes slowly but measurably over centuries and millennia. The North Star of today, Polaris, was not the North Star of ancient Egypt, and it will not be the North Star of the distant future. What is remarkable is that ancient cultures knew about this. The Hindus called the Great Cycle the Yuga system. The ancient Greeks described the Platonic year. The Egyptians encoded it into the architecture of their temples. The Maya calculated it with extraordinary precision. Tracking precession requires not years of observation, but centuries, possibly millennia, of careful, systematic astronomical record-keeping. It requires a civilization with the stability, the institutions, and the technological capacity to maintain unbroken records across enormous stretches of time. For such knowledge to exist in the ancient world, it must have been accumulated by a civilization that was doing serious astronomy long before Egypt, long before Sumer, long before the civilizations we call the first. This is not mythology. This is mathematics. And mathematics does not lie. Visualize being in a scenario where you are handed a beautiful piece of music and told to simply enjoy it. You listen, and it is lovely. But then someone sits beside you and begins pointing out the mathematical structure beneath the melody, the Fibonacci sequences in the timing, the golden ratio in the intervals, the harmonic relationships between the instruments. And suddenly, the music you thought you knew becomes something else entirely. It becomes a message wearing the costume of beauty. That is what happens when you look at ancient temples the right way. The temples of ancient Egypt were not built simply as houses of worship. They were, according to the Egyptian texts themselves, machines of cosmic alignment. The temple at Karnak, for example, was constructed so that on the winter solstice, the rising sun would send a beam of light shooting down the central axis of the building, illuminating the innermost sanctuary. This required not just architectural skill, but astronomical precision, calculated to a specific date and a specific moment in the precessional cycle. The Parthenon in Athens is oriented so that its front door faces the rising sun on the precise morning of Athena's feast day. The ancient temple complex at Teotihuacan in Mexico is laid out according to a grid that appears to encode astronomical distances in its proportions, specifically the distances of the planets from the sun, scaled to an extraordinarily precise ratio. These are not buildings. They are encoded instruments. They are three-dimensional books written in the only language that transcends the boundaries of spoken tongue, mathematics and geometry. Every ancient culture that built in stone seems to have understood something we are only beginning to re-understand. That knowledge to survive catastrophe must be built into something that cannot burn, something that cannot be translated away or deliberately erased, something that simply stands, waiting patiently for a civilization wise enough to read it. Imagine if you had grown up without electric light. From the moment of your earliest memory, the night sky above you was a living tapestry, a vast and breathing map of light that shifted with the seasons and the years. Every star would be familiar, the way familiar faces are familiar. You would know the sky the way you know your own hands. That was the ancient human relationship with the heavens. Before electricity, before indoor entertainment, Before the thousand distractions of modern life, the night sky was the central organizing reality of human existence. It told farmers when to plant and when to harvest. It guided sailors across open ocean. It marked the turning points of the year. And it told stories. Deep, ancient stories that encoded the accumulated wisdom of generations. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomers compiled star catalogues of extraordinary detail. They tracked the planets, distinguished them from fixed stars, and developed the foundational mathematical models for predicting celestial movements. The ancient Egyptians oriented their pyramids and temples to stars with a precision that required continuous observation across multiple lifetimes. Ancient Indian astronomers calculated the sidereal year, the time it takes Earth to orbit the Sun relative to distant stars, to within a handful of seconds of the modern measurement. But here is the piece that most people overlook. The oldest star catalogues we possess contain information about star positions that do not match the sky as it appeared at the time the documents were written. They match the sky as it appeared thousands of years earlier due to the slow drift of precession. This means the information in those catalogues was not newly observed, it was inherited. Copied from older records passed down from an earlier time when someone, somewhere, was watching the sky very carefully and writing it all down. What if you were told that somewhere in your genetic code, woven into the molecular architecture of every cell in your body, there is a record, not just of your parents and grandparents, but of every ancestor stretching back across hundreds of thousands of years? Not a story, a literal biological archive. That is what human DNA actually is. Modern genetics has quietly revolutionized our understanding of human prehistory, and some of its findings are deeply, productively unsettling. Analysis of ancient DNA from archaeological sites around the world has revealed the existence of human populations that simply do not fit into the neat family tree we thought we had constructed. Populations with no clear origin point. Populations that appear, contribute their genetics to surrounding groups, and then vanish from the record entirely. The Denisovans, identified from a single finger bone fragment found in a Siberian cave, appear in the genetic record of populations as geographically scattered as Melanesia, Tibet, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They were clearly a widespread and adaptable people. Their bones are almost entirely absent from the archaeological record. Their genetic legacy is not. More troubling still, some ancient DNA studies have identified genetic signatures in populations whose origins cannot be traced to any known archaeological culture. The so-called basal Eurasian lineage, found in ancient Middle Eastern populations, appears to have split from all other known human lineages at an extremely early date and then existed in relative isolation for tens of thousands of years. Where? Doing what? The forgotten bloodlines are not simply a genealogical curiosity. They are evidence of human populations living, building, and perhaps civilizing in places and at times we have not yet found. The story written in our bones is not the story we were told. It is older, stranger, and far more populated with mystery. Picture yourself hiking through a remote stretch of landscape, far from any road, and coming across a stone figure half buried in the earth. Its dimensions are impossible. Its face, barely visible above the soil line, has an expression of absolute serenity. You clear away some of the earth around it and discover that what you thought was the complete figure is only the head. The body extends downward, 10, 15, 20 meters into the ground, sleeping in the dark. This is exactly what happened on Easter Island in the 1950s and 60s, when researchers discovered that the famous Moai heads were not simply heads at all. They were complete figures, their bodies buried under centuries of accumulated sediment and volcanic ash, covered in carvings and inscriptions that have been hidden from view for generations. The sleeping giants of Easter Island are a metaphor as much as they are a discovery. How much of what we think we understand about ancient civilization is in fact the visible portion of something far larger, buried beneath our assumptions. Across the world, monumental figures and structures exist that archaeology has not fully excavated, explained, or contextualized. The Sphinx at Giza shows evidence, according to geologist Robert Schoch, of water erosion on its lower body, consistent with sustained rainfall that last occurred in the region around 10,000 to 7,000 BC, thousands of years before the conventional dating of its construction. If correct, its body has been buried and re-excavated multiple times across a history far longer than we recognize. The sleeping giants teach us something essential. The past is not behind us, it is beneath us, and the part we can see, the heads above the soil line, may be the smallest portion of a story whose full dimensions we have not yet imagined. Think about the last time you sat around a fire, even a small one, a candle, a campfire, a fireplace. Notice how naturally your mind begins to drift, how the flickering light seems to pull stories out of the air, how conversation deepens, slows, becomes more honest. Fire has always been the birthplace of myth. And myths, for all their strangeness, carry something that dry historical documents often do not: emotional truth. Every ancient culture on Earth has a myth about fire being given to humanity by a divine or semi-divine figure. Prometheus, in Greek mythology, steals fire from the gods and brings it to humans, suffering eternal punishment as a consequence. In Hindu tradition, the fire god Agni carries divine knowledge between the worlds of gods and humans. In Cherokee legend, fire was first brought from a distant island across dangerous water. Indigenous Australian traditions describe the first fire as a gift from the Sky People. Now, myths do not arise from nothing. They arise from something that happened, something so significant that the community needed to explain it, preserve it, and repeat it. The almost universal myth of fire as a gift from supernatural beings rather than a human discovery is curious. What if it is not simply a metaphor for the value of fire, but a memory of a time when an advanced people shared their knowledge of fire-related technology with less developed communities? The myths of Prometheus and his counterparts across cultures all share a common emotional core. Knowledge was given. Knowledge was dangerous. Knowledge changed everything. And the givers were punished, or disappeared, or withdrew. Whatever the mythic fire represents in its deepest layer, the story of a catastrophic gift from a more advanced source is encoded in the cultural DNA of the entire human family. That kind of agreement across cultures does not happen by coincidence. Suppose you found yourself sitting with an elder in a small village far from any city, and this elder began to tell you a story. Not a story from a book, but a story passed down through oral tradition across more generations than either of you could count. The details were specific, the geography was precise, the emotional weight of the telling was unmistakably that of someone sharing a memory, not inventing an entertainment. Would you dismiss what you heard as fiction? For much of Western academic history, oral traditions were treated with condescension. Legends were assumed to be embellished, distorted, or simply invented to explain what illiterate peoples could not understand scientifically. This assumption has been eroding steadily for decades, and in some remarkable cases it has collapsed entirely. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describe specific geographic features, waterways, and islands that no longer exist above sea level. Features that were drowned by rising seas at the end of the last ice age more than 7,000 years ago. When geological surveys confirmed the existence of these submerged features, it meant that the oral record had preserved accurate geographic information across more than 300 generations. Indigenous traditions in coastal regions around the world describe great floods, sudden disappearances of land, and the memory of landscapes that are now underwater. The oral histories of Pacific Island peoples contain sophisticated astronomical knowledge, navigation techniques, and genealogical records stretching back dozens of generations. Whispered legends are not inferior to written records. In some cases, they may be more reliable because they were passed down within living communities, corrected and refined by people who had reason to get the details right. The most important information a civilization needs to survive a catastrophe is not carved in stone. It is spoken, quietly, urgently, from one generation to the next. Imagine standing in the middle of Stonehenge at dawn on the summer solstice. The air is cold, the sky is just beginning to lighten at the horizon, and then the sun rises perfectly framed between the massive standing stones, flooding the central altar with golden light. Around you, the stones stand in absolute silence. They have stood in this silence for more than 4,000 years, and they have not said a single word. And yet, they have said everything. The megaliths of the world, the stone circles, the dolmens, the standing stones, the great passage tombs, speak a language that does not require words. They speak through alignment, proportion, mass, and position. And what they say consistently is this: we were built by people who understood the sky deeply, who cared about the long arc of cosmic time, and who wanted to leave behind something that would survive everything. Stonehenge required the transport of stones weighing up to 25 tons from a quarry 240 kilometres away, a feat that engineers and archaeologists still struggle to fully explain. The passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland is aligned so precisely to the winter solstice sunrise that for 5 days around the solstice, a beam of light enters a rooftop opening and travels 19 metres down a stone passage to illuminate the inner chamber, an alignment maintained with accuracy. Across 5,000 years. These are not primitive structures. They are instruments of extraordinary precision built by people who were, in the most meaningful sense, sophisticated. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the silence of a message already delivered, already encoded, already waiting for the listener patient enough to stop talking long enough to hear it. The stones do not need to speak. They have already spoken. We simply have not yet learned how to listen. What if you were led, blindfolded, into a deep cave, and when the blindfold was removed, you found yourself standing in a cavern whose walls were entirely covered in enormous glowing crystals, some of them taller than a house, their translucent surfaces catching the light and scattering it into 1,000 shimmering pieces? The air would feel different in such a place, heavier, more electric, as though the cave itself were breathing. This is not fantasy. The Cave of the Crystals in Nica, Mexico, contains gypsum selenite crystals up to 11 meters long and 4 meters wide, among the largest natural crystals ever found on Earth. The cave remained sealed for hundreds of thousands of years, its contents growing slowly in total darkness, and was only discovered in the year 2000 by miners drilling into the earth. Ancient cultures the world over attributed extraordinary properties to crystals and minerals. The Egyptians used specific stones in burial rituals with a precision that suggested they believed in particular energetic or spiritual properties. The ancient Chinese classified jade as a conduit of cosmic energy. Celtic traditions used quartz crystals in specific ways in sacred practice. Native American medicine traditions incorporated crystals extensively. Modern science understands crystals as ordered molecular lattices with measurable physical properties. They conduct electricity. They oscillate at precise frequencies. Quartz crystals are literally inside your watch right now, vibrating 32,768 times per second to keep time with extraordinary accuracy. Is it possible that ancient peoples understood something about the physical properties of crystals that they expressed through spiritual language because they had no other vocabulary for it? The language of science and the language of the sacred often describe the same phenomena from different angles. The crystals do not care which language you use. They simply continue doing what they have always done. Vibrating in the dark, keeping perfect time, telling no one what they know. Close your eyes and picture holding a perfectly clear crystal up to a beam of morning sunlight. Watch how the light does not simply pass through it, but bends, splits, and scatters into a full spectrum of colour across the wall behind you. The crystal does not create the light. It reveals what was already there, hidden inside what looked like ordinary white brightness. Something complex and beautiful, concealed within something simple. That image is more than poetic. It is a key. Ancient civilizations treated crystals not as decorative objects but as functional tools of sacred science. The Egyptians placed specific stones in precise locations within temples and burial chambers, not randomly, but according to systems that combined astronomical alignment with material properties. Lapis lazuli, carnelian, turquoise, and clear quartz each served distinct roles in their spiritual and architectural practice. The Romans described a lens made of crystal that could concentrate the sun's light, and ancient texts from India reference the use of crystals in instruments designed to focus energy. Modern physics confirms what these traditions intuited through different language. Crystals are among the most ordered structures in nature. Their atoms arrange themselves in repeating geometric lattices with almost mathematical perfection. This structural regularity gives crystals measurable, reliable physical properties, piezoelectricity, the ability to generate an electrical charge under mechanical pressure, optical clarity, and vibrational frequency stability precise enough to regulate modern timekeeping devices. The aha moment here is gentle but powerful. When an ancient Egyptian priest placed a quartz crystal at the heart of a sacred chamber, was he practicing superstition? Or was he applying, in the language available to him, a working knowledge of material science that we have only recently rediscovered in laboratory settings? The crystal does not distinguish between the priest and the physicist. It simply does what it has always done, radiating what is hidden, revealing what was always there. Picture yourself standing at the very edge of a ship's deck at night, far from any land, the ocean stretching in every direction to the horizon and beyond. Below you, the water descends into absolute darkness, thousands of meters of cold, pressurized silence that no human eye has ever seen. And somewhere down there, settled into the sediment of the deep ocean floor, are secrets that the sea has kept for 10,000 years or more. We speak about space exploration with breathless reverence. We map the surfaces of Mars and the moons of Jupiter with growing precision, and yet the floor of our own ocean, the largest and most immediate unknown on our own planet, remains more than 80% unexplored in meaningful detail. We know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. This is not a trivial oversight. It is a profound one. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters as the great ice sheets of the Northern Hemisphere melted. This rise did not happen overnight, but it was, in geological terms, relatively swift, and it permanently submerged what had been vast coastal regions where early humans lived, fished, farmed, and built. The continental shelves of every ocean represent millions of square kilometers of lost land. Land that was above water during the peak of the last glacial period. Oceanographers who have surveyed portions of these submerged shelves have found evidence of ancient river channels, submerged forests, and in some locations, anomalous structures that do not match known natural geological formations. The ocean, in short, has not simply covered empty land, it has covered human history. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but it does not keep them forever. With every new dive, every new sonar survey, the water grows slightly less opaque, and the past grows slightly less silent. Let yourself drift for a moment into a half-waking state, that quiet boundary between sleep and consciousness, where the mind moves freely and images arise without effort. Ancient cultures across the world had a name for this state. They called it the dream time, the threshold, the space between worlds, and many of them believe that in this space the past was not gone, but accessible. That memory did not die, it merely submerged, like a landscape beneath a rising tide. The ocean, in the mythologies of nearly every maritime civilization, is not simply a body of water. It is a living repository, a dreaming archive. The Polynesian peoples who navigated the Pacific Ocean across thousands of kilometers without instruments spoke of the ocean as a living entity that communicated with those skilled enough to listen. They read the ocean through the movement of swells, the behavior of stars reflected in still water, the flight patterns of birds, the temperature changes beneath their hands. The ocean was not an obstacle. It was a language. In Hindu cosmology, the cosmic ocean, called the Kshira Sagara, or ocean of milk, is the source from which creation itself emerges. The churning of this ocean by gods and demons produces not just the world, but wisdom, medicine, and divine knowledge. The ocean, in this vision, is generative. It holds everything that exists and everything that has existed. Modern oceanography has discovered that the deep ocean is not the static, barren place it was once assumed to be. It pulses with slow currents that take centuries to complete full circuits around the globe. It stores heat and carbon on timescales that influence the entire planetary climate. It has memory, in the scientific sense, of past conditions encoded in its chemistry. The dreaming ocean is not a metaphor that science has disproven. It is, in its own way, a metaphor that science has confirmed. Think about what it feels like to cup your hands beneath a cold, clear stream and drink. That moment of contact, the water moving over your palms, its temperature and weight and slight resistance, there is something in that sensation that feels older than thought. Like a memory your body carries that your mind has no words for. Water is the oldest sacred substance on Earth, and not arbitrarily so. Every major ancient civilization built its earliest centers of culture along rivers and coastlines: the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. Water was not merely convenient for agriculture and transport. It was ritually central. The Egyptians performed daily purification rituals in water before entering sacred spaces. The Mesopotamians built elaborate canal systems that their texts describe in terms that blend engineering with reverence. The Hindu tradition of pilgrimage to sacred rivers continues to this day, with the Ganges considered not merely a river, but a living deity. Water appears in the origin stories of virtually every human culture. In Genesis, the Spirit of God moves over the face of the waters before creation begins. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the primordial ocean is the first thing that exists, from which all else emerges. Indigenous creation stories from the Americas, from Oceania, from Africa, all begin with water. Why? Why does water hold this universal sacred status across traditions that had no contact with one another? Because water is, in the most literal sense, where life came from. The chemistry of life emerged in ancient oceans. The cells in your body are still largely composed of salt water, maintaining an internal ocean that mirrors the primordial environment from which life first arose. When ancient peoples treated water as sacred, they were not being superstitious. They were being accurate. They were honouring the truth written into every cell of every living thing that has ever existed. Imagine being an archaeologist. You are careful, methodical, patient. You brush dust from stone with a small, soft brush, centimetre by careful centimetre, revealing what has been hidden for centuries. And then you uncover something that does not fit. A level of technological precision that should not be present in the layer where you found it. A tool, a structure, an artifact that belongs to a period of human capability that you were told had not yet arrived. Archaeology calls these anomalies out-of-place artifacts, and there are more of them than most textbooks acknowledge. The ruins of Pumapunku in modern Bolivia feature stone blocks of diorite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, cut with such precision that their surfaces are flatto to within a fraction of a millimetre. The blocks interlock with each other using H-shaped joints of extraordinary complexity. They bear no tool marks that correspond to any instrument archaeologists have identified as belonging to the civilization thought to have built them. They look, with unsettling directness, like they were machined. The megalithic sites of Peru, particularly Sacsayhuaman, feature stones weighing in excess of 100 tons fitted together so precisely that a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. No mortar was used. The stones simply rest against each other, their irregular surfaces shaped to match their neighbours with a perfection that modern stonemasons describe as nearly impossible to replicate. The timeless ruins of the world's ancient sites speak not of primitive people struggling with stone, but of a sophisticated engineering culture in command of methods we do not yet fully understand. Here is the philosophical takeaway. When evidence does not fit the story, the honest response is not to discard the evidence, it is to reconsider the story. The ruins are not confused. Our understanding of them may be. What if you could fall asleep tonight and wake up with perfect, detailed memories of a life you had never lived? Memories so specific and vivid that you could describe the colour of the walls in rooms you had never entered, the names of people you had never met, the geography of places you had never visited? This is, in certain spiritual and philosophical traditions, not a fantasy. It is a description of what memory actually is at its deepest level. The concept of collective memory, the idea that certain knowledge and experience can be transmitted across generations, not just through language and written record, but through something more fundamental, has been explored by psychologists, philosophers, and, increasingly, geneticists. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious, the shared reservoir of human experience that surfaces in myths, archetypes, and symbols common across all cultures. Modern epigenetics, the science of how environmental experiences can influence genetic expression across generations, has begun to provide a biological framework for understanding how trauma and memory might be inherited. Studies in mice have demonstrated that fear responses to specific stimuli can be transmitted to offspring who have never encountered the stimulus themselves. The mechanisms by which this occurs are still being investigated, but the phenomenon itself has been replicated. Ancient oral traditions often describe genealogical knowledge not as something learned, but as something remembered, not intellectually acquired, but somatically present, carried in the body. Indigenous traditions around the world speak of ancestral memory as a living reality, something accessible through specific practices, songs, ceremonies, and relationships with landscape. Deep memory, the memory that lives below the level of the individual lifetime, may be more than metaphor. It may be the mechanism by which our species has preserved its most important knowledge across the very longest stretches of time, carrying it quietly through catastrophe and forgetting, to arrive, intact, in the present moment. Picture yourself walking through a great stone cathedral, not looking at anything in particular, simply moving through the space, and then you stop, because the sound of your own footsteps has changed. The acoustics of the room have shifted. Your voice, if you spoke, would fill the space with a resonance that feels almost physical. The stone itself seems to be listening. Ancient peoples were acutely aware of sound, and many of their sacred structures were built with acoustic properties as deliberate as their astronomical alignments. Researcher at Princeton University and archaeoacoustician studying Newgrange, the Irish Passage tomb, built more than 5,000 years ago, have found that the chamber produces a standing wave at a frequency of around 110 Hz when sound is generated inside it. This frequency corresponds to the lower register of the adult human male voice chanting. Studies of the brain's response to sustained exposure to this frequency suggest it may alter states of consciousness, in ways that ancient ritualists would have recognized and valued. The ancient cave paintings of Lascaux in France are concentrated in areas of the cave that produce the strongest natural echoes. Researchers propose that the acoustic properties of these locations made them feel inhabited, animate, sacred, and that the paintings were made in response to that felt presence. The stone circles of Britain have been found to produce acoustic phenomena, including infrasound, sound below the threshold of conscious hearing, that can affect human physiology in measurable ways, inducing feelings of awe, unease, or altered perception. Ancient peoples were not simply building places to pray, they were building instruments, enormous stone instruments tuned to specific frequencies designed to alter human consciousness, facilitate particular states of awareness, and perhaps communicate across the boundary that separates the ordinary world from whatever lies beyond it. The echo, it turns out, is the message. Let yourself settle into something a little unusual today. Suppose you are a geologist, lowered in a pressurized vehicle deep into the earth, past the crust, past the upper mantle, moving into territory no human has ever physically entered. Around you, the temperature climbs and the pressure becomes almost unimaginable, and yet, the deeper you go, the more you realize that the Earth's interior is not the uniform, solid mass you once imagined. It is layered, complex, dynamic, and in some ways, stranger than fiction. The idea of a hollow Earth, a vast interior space where civilizations might persist out of sight, is of course not supported by modern geology. The Earth's interior is known to consist of a liquid outer core and a solid inner core of iron and nickel, under pressures and temperatures incompatible with any life as we know it. But the hollow Earth idea, which appears in the mythologies and sacred texts of dozens of ancient cultures, points to something real, even if the literal interpretation is not accurate. The Hopi people of the American Southwest describe their ancestors as having emerged from a world beneath the earth through a hole in the ground called the Sapapu. The Norse spoke of Asgard, Midgard, and Helheim as vertically arranged worlds. The Greeks described the underworld of Hades as a fully realized realm below the surface. The Tibetan tradition speaks of Agartha, a hidden kingdom beneath the Himalayas. These stories are not geology. But they may be something else. They may be encoded accounts of underground refuge, of cave systems and subterranean shelters used during periods of catastrophic surface conditions. The Earth has extensive cave systems, some of which have never been fully explored. During an ice age or volcanic catastrophe, underground survival would not be mythological. It would be practical. The hollow Earth was not a scientific fact, but the impulse to descend, to find shelter in the deep earth, may be one of humanity's oldest and most urgent memories. Think about standing at a harbour, watching a small boat disappear over the horizon. The moment it crosses that curve of the earth and vanishes from sight, it enters a kind of mystery. It exists, certainly, and moves through real water. But from where you stand, it might as well have entered another world. Now imagine the courage of the first human beings who crossed not a harbour but an ocean, with no knowledge of what lay on the other side. For most of the 20th century, the prevailing academic view held that ancient peoples did not cross open oceans. The great civilizations developed independently, separated by water into isolated developmental tracts. This view has been steadily, quietly dismantled. Genetic analysis of populations in South America and Polynesia has confirmed direct contact between these groups approximately 800 years ago, a contact that required navigating thousands of kilometers of open Pacific Ocean. Polynesian sweet potatoes and chicken bones found in pre-Columbian South American archaeological sites confirm this connection in the physical record. Cocaine and tobacco residue found in Egyptian mummies dated to around 1000 BC have been confirmed by multiple independent analyses. These plants were, at that point in history, found only in the Americas. Their presence in Egyptian burial contexts demands an explanation. Thor Heyerdahl built a balsa wood raft in 1947 and sailed it from Peru to Polynesia to demonstrate that such crossings were technologically feasible for ancient peoples. The academic establishment dismissed the voyage as irrelevant. The genetics, however, has not been so easily dismissed. The ancient world was not a collection of isolated islands of civilization, each evolving in ignorance of the others. It was a network. A web of distant shores connected by bold, skilled, and knowledgeable navigators whose voyages the ocean quietly recorded even when history did not. Consider what it would be like if you travelled to 5 countries on 5 different continents, places with no historical contact with each other, and in each place you found the same symbol carved into ancient stone. Not a similar symbol, not a related one, the same one. Precisely. How would you explain that? This is not a thought experiment. It is a documented reality. The spiral appears in the Neolithic rock art of Ireland, in the ancient petroglyphs of New Mexico, in the temple carvings of Malta, in the sacred art of the Maori people of New Zealand, and in the pre-dynastic pottery of ancient Egypt. These cultures had no known contact. They were separated by oceans and centuries. And yet, the spiral is everywhere. The same is true of the cross within a circle. The swastika in its original form as a symbol of cosmic motion used across ancient cultures on every inhabited continent long before its modern associations. The concentric circles, the serpent eating its own tail, the Ouroboros appearing in ancient Egypt, in Norse mythology, in Hindu texts, in the traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Carl Jung argued that certain symbols are archetypal, meaning they arise from the deep structure of the human mind rather than from cultural transmission. This is one possible explanation. The symbols are not shared because they were taught from one culture to another. They are shared because they emerge from something universal in human consciousness. But there is another possibility. What if the symbols were taught? What if they originated in a single source, a civilization whose influence was wide enough and deep enough to seed the same symbolic vocabulary into cultures across the entire inhabited world? Both explanations are extraordinary, and both, in their different ways, point to the same conclusion. These symbols are not decoration. They are language, and someone, somewhere, wanted to make sure the whole world learned to speak it. Imagine a flame that has been burning continuously for over 1,500 years, not metaphorically, literally. A physical fire tended by dedicated keepers never allowed to go out, maintained through wars and famines and the rise and fall of empires. This is not mythology. The flame of Zoroaster, maintained by Zoroastrian priests in Yazd, Iran, has been burning without interruption since approximately the 5th century of the Common Era, and possibly much longer, as a continuation of a sacred fire tradition dating back thousands of years. The eternal flame is one of humanity's oldest sacred concepts, and it appears everywhere. The Olympic flame in ancient Greece was maintained continuously and carried from Olympia to each city that hosted the games. The Vestal Virgins of ancient Rome were charged with maintaining the sacred fire of the goddess Vesta, a flame whose extinction was considered a catastrophe for the state. The Hindu tradition of the yajna, the sacred fire ritual, is described in the Vedas in terms that suggest it has been maintained continuously for at least 3,000 years. Indigenous traditions across the Americas kept ceremonial fires burning as the living centers of community and spiritual life. The eternal flame is not simply a symbol of remembrance or devotion, though it is both of those things. In its deeper meaning, it is a statement about continuity, about the determination to carry something forward through time, unchanged, unbroken, alive. What is the flame carrying? What knowledge, what essence, what understanding is encoded in the act of keeping the fire burning across generations of human change and catastrophe? Perhaps the answer is simpler than we expect. Perhaps the flame is carrying the memory of a time when fire was the most precious thing in the world, given at great cost and maintained with absolute devotion, because without it, the darkness was complete. Think about what it feels like to hold a very old photograph. The colours have shifted, the edges are soft with age. The faces looking back at you belong to people who are gone, who lived entire lives that you can barely imagine. There is something bittersweet in the holding of it, a tenderness that comes from knowing this fragment is all that remains of something much larger, something whole. That feeling is the feeling of archaeology. The relics that survive from ancient civilizations are, almost without exception, the most durable objects those civilizations produced. Stone, ceramic, gold. These survive. Cloth, wood, paper, leather, food, language, music, social structure, philosophy and oral form, none of these survive intact, if at all. What we hold in our hands from the ancient world is the skeleton, not the living body. And even the skeleton is disappearing. The Great Sphinx of Giza has lost significant surface detail to weathering in the past 200 years alone. The irreplaceable cuneiform tablets of Iraq, tens of thousands of them, have been scattered and looted in recent decades. Cave paintings thousands of years old, stable for millennia, are degrading due to changes in humidity and temperature caused by tourism and industrial activity nearby. We are losing the past faster than we are recovering it. But here is the philosophical note that quietly reframes all of this. A fading relic is not simply a loss, it is a transmission. Every object that has survived to reach us has done so against extraordinary odds, through floods and fires and conquests and the patient work of geological time. The fact that any ancient object exists in a museum or an excavation site today is itself a kind of miracle. The relic chose to survive. Or something ensured that it did. And perhaps the question we should be asking is not how much we have lost, but why these particular fragments were the ones that remained. Picture yourself walking through an old-growth forest, one of those rare places where the trees are so large and ancient that the canopy closes over you like a cathedral ceiling. The roots of the oldest trees spread across the ground in every direction, interconnecting with the roots of neighbouring trees, sometimes fusing together, creating a network beneath the soil that is invisible but essential. The forest above the ground is the part you can see. The forest below the ground is what makes it possible. Civilization is like this. What we see of ancient cultures, their monuments, their artifacts, their written records, is the above-ground portion of a much deeper root system. The visible parts draw our attention and shape our understanding, but the invisible roots, the oral traditions, the social structures, the agricultural knowledge, the navigational wisdom, the spiritual practices, these are what nourished the entire system and made the visible achievements possible. The hidden roots of modern civilization reach back farther than most history books suggest. The mathematical principles underlying modern architecture were known in ancient Babylon. The heliocentric model of the solar system, commonly attributed to Copernicus in the 16th century, was described by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristarchus of Samos approximately 1,800 years earlier. The ancient Indian mathematician Brahmagupta formulated rules for arithmetic involving zero and negative numbers in the 7th century of the Common Era, building on a tradition of Indian mathematical thought stretching back far earlier. These are not footnotes, they are roots. Every branch of modern knowledge has ancient roots that, if traced carefully enough, reach back through layers of civilization to something deeper and older than our standard timelines acknowledge. The tree of human knowledge was not planted in ancient Greece or the Renaissance. It was planted long before, in soil we have not yet fully excavated. We live among the branches without knowing the depth of what holds us up. Suppose you found yourself walking across an empty plain at dusk, and on the horizon you made out a shape, massive, still. As you came closer, you realized it was a stone figure, taller than a house, its features worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, gazing across the landscape with an expression that seemed neither hostile nor welcoming, simply ancient, simply present. Monumental statuary is one of the most persistent mysteries of the ancient world. not simply because of the technical challenges involved in creating such figures, though those are considerable, but because of what they reveal about the civilizations that made them. The Easter Island Moai, nearly 900 of them, range in height from just over 2 meters to more than 20 meters, with the largest weighing in excess of 80 tons. They were carved from volcanic rock using only basalt stone tools, transported across the island through methods that are still debated, and erected on stone platforms called ahu, that were themselves significant engineering achievements. The people who created them had no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no draft animals. The colossal statues of ancient Egypt, including the great seated figures of Rameses II at Abu Simbel, were carved from single pieces of stone and positioned within temples aligned to solar events with celestial precision. The statue of the Sphinx, as previously noted, may be far older than its surrounding temples. The gentle giants of the ancient world all share something beyond their scale. They gaze, they witness, they watch the horizon or the sky with an attention that is fixed and eternal. They seem less like works of art and more like sentinels, placed at specific locations for specific purposes by people who believed the watching mattered. What were they watching for? What did they expect to arrive? And is it possible that whatever was anticipated has not yet come? Think about the feeling of watching the tide come in. You are sitting on a beach. The water retreats, exposing sand and rock and the quiet life of the intertidal zone. And then, slowly but with absolute inevitability, the water returns. It does not hurry. It does not announce itself. It simply comes back, as it has always come back, as it will always come back, because the forces that govern it are larger than any single moment of retreat. That image is, perhaps, the most honest metaphor for what we are doing when we search for Atlantis and the civilization that was wiped from memory. The tide of human civilization has gone out before. Great cultures have retreated, been swallowed, been forgotten. The silence of submerged cities, the encoded messages in ancient stone, the whispered legends carried forward through generations of oral tradition. These are not the sounds of defeat. They are the sound of a tide that went out, and tides always return. Modern archaeologists are finding, in increasing numbers, evidence that human civilization is older, more widespread, and more sophisticated than the conventional timeline suggests. LiDAR technology, a remote sensing method using laser light, has revealed vast, previously unknown urban networks beneath the jungle canopy of Central America, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Underwater survey technology is mapping submerged landscapes that were above water 10,000 years ago. Genetic analysis is uncovering human migrations and cultural connections that no written record preserved. The returning tide of discovery is, in its quiet way, confirming what the stories always said, that something large and significant and beautiful once existed, that it was lost, and that the loss was not permanent. We are, in this moment, standing at the waterline, watching the tide come in, watching the ancient world return to us, piece by piece, fact by fact, ruin by ruin, carried forward on the same patient, inevitable current that has always governed the deeper rhythms of this remarkable, remembering planet.